Hey everybody, we are starting recording on Chapter 4, and Chapter 4 is a deeper dive, a deep dive into the fundamentals of cascading style sheets. And so HTML is a language that we've done a little bit of a deep dive. There's a lot more to learn about HTML, but we've at least learned the fundamentals and at a deeper level. And now we're going to learn at a deeper level some fundamentals about CSS. Again, we've introduced it, but now we're going to do a little bit deeper dive. Again, just like HTML, what's the importance of CSS? You cannot work on a web page without knowing CSS unless you're doing some sort of drag and drop tool like Squarespace or something like that. The challenge around using those drag and drop tools is that they don't provide the customization a lot of the times that you want. And so a lot of people who end up using the drag and drop, Squarespace type tools to build their website, they find themselves limited in being able to do what they want on their site. And so being able to write the code, be it the HTML and the CSS, allows for that full customization of a website without restrictions. And so CSS is a fundamental language that if you're going to build a fully customizable website, it's a foundational language. You have to know CSS. Again, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and the key word there is style. Okay? How the web page looks. In other words, it's formatting. With CSS, we can do a lot, and that's what this chapter is all about. And so we're going to cover the different ways to include CSS in a web page. We're jumping down to the knowledge, how to include CSS in a web page, why we prefer, even though there's 3 ways to write CSS, the preferred way is using an external style sheet, and kind of why is that. We're going to go over this thing called Normalize CSS. We're going to cover some different units of measurement, so things like pixels and points and all these different values that we can use in CSS. We're going to cover colors in CSS and how CSS has versions 1, 2, and 3. If I just say CSS, you could pretty much assume nowadays I'm talking about the latest version, which is 3. CSS version 3 includes everything from version 2 and includes everything from version 1. We're going to expand our understanding of selectors. And if we think back to chapter 1, we studied selectors, properties, and values. And we studied that selectors can be certain things like elements, classes, and IDs. But you'll notice here, there's a lot more kinds of selectors that we haven't covered yet. And so we're going to cover some various selectors and how to select parts of our HTML and work with different parts of our HTML. We're going to, as always, cover accessibility with CSS. What is this important with an exclamation point? What is that all about? And how does that affect the CSS that we write? There's a list of CSS properties that we're going to cover. Okay, again, remember, selector, property, value. Those are the different pieces of a rule, of a CSS rule. Well, there's a font family selector. There's a font style, font weight, font size, line height. These are all properties, which is a certain part of a CSS rule, as well as text indent, text align, text decoration, text shadow. Okay. Get into it. Let's write some code. What are the 3 ways to write CSS? Okay, let's pop open Visual Studio, and I'm going to give a code demonstration to show you the 3 different ways to write CSS. This is good stuff. This is important, very important. So I'm just going to open up my repo here. And this is chapter 4, so I'll just throw it in the chapter 4 homework. Tick, tick, tick. So I'll just create an HTML page here. Sometimes it takes a second to get this to work. I'll let Visual Studio catch up. There you go. Just took Visual Studio a minute to CSS demo. The first way that you can write CSS is called Inline Css. That's my email. Let me close that. Inline CSS. Going back in history into the 90s, in HTML version 4, we now have what's called separations of concern nowadays. And separations of concern means that our HTML does some things and our CSS does other things. And you separate those concerns. What are those concerns? Well, the structure in the content, those are the concerns for the HTML, and the styling is for the CSS. For the look, the look of our content is with CSS. Well, in the old days, HTML4, all of that was merged together. And so styling was built into the HTML. There actually used to be a font tag, and you do something like font color equals yellow, and you would say something, like a paragraph tag here, and that would be how you would change the text to yellow. In the old days, we don't do that anymore. That's a big no-no nowadays. Okay. We now have separation of concern, which allows us to write code more efficiently. Okay, the reason I talk about the separation of concern is because inline CSS is really not that great at separating concerns. And so I'll write some inline CSS. The way that you write inline CSS, get my little teacup out of the way here. It's a coffee cup, teacup, whatever. Is with the style attribute. This is the paragraph tag. Remember, whoops. These are called attributes. Well, is that really that different than what we used to do in HTML4? Granted, there used to be a tag, but the CSS that we're writing it basically belongs to this individual paragraph. And so it's really not too different. It's going to be hard to see. Yellow text. By the way, this is an example of bad contrast. This is really bad. You don't want to do that, right? So when you change a font color, you want to put it on top of a background color that contrasts well and makes it easy to read. Yellow text on a white background, you can't even read that, right? So what you might do is you might say, right, so now that would contrast a little bit better. Okay, I gotta stop closing this so I can just refresh. Okay, this is called inline CSS. It's something that you can write. However, I don't really write inline CSS 90, make up in a percentage, 95%, 98% of the time. For me, I use this when I'm troubleshooting. And what I mean when I'm troubleshooting is that I just can't get this text to go yellow. I'm trying to change this text to yellow. It's not working. I don't know why it's not working. So let me write some inline CSS, because when it comes to how important, or let me rephrase that, how specific a rule is, right? the more specific a CSS rule, the higher importance it has. And so writing something inline CSS is very specific because it's very specific to this paragraph. If I were to write another paragraph, you could see that that inline style did not affect that other paragraph. If I write a third paragraph, you could probably guess it only affects that one paragraph. Okay? So again, how is this done? This is done with a style attribute, and then you write your properties and values separated by semicolons. So what do we have here? We have a style attribute that belongs to the HTML. We have a CSS property called the color property. Then we have the value of yellow. Then we have a semicolon to say we're going to add another property, which is background color property, colon, value, and then another semicolon. Now this last semicolon, it's not mandatory. You could leave this off and it would still work. However, it is recommended. I do recommend that last semicolon because that just allows you to start typing, another. You don't have to, if you just start typing another property, that increases the font size. And I'll teach you about what an M is. That's pronounced like the letter M, 3 M's. Okay, I'll cover that here in a little bit, so don't stress that part right now. But I do recommend this last semicolon, although it's not mandatory. Now let's see if I remove any other semicolon, like let's just remove that semicolon, and you could probably guess based on Visual Studio that it's probably gonna, yeah, that doesn't exactly work. Didn't get the yellow background colors. Somehow it got the font size. You can definitely see that it broke. Right, so don't forget your semicolons between the different declarations, which are property value pairs. Yeah, again, that's my recommendation. The comment that was made was that Prettier, which is an extension in Visual Studio, defaulted to removing that semicolon. I tend to use Beautify as my formatter for my HTML and my CSS. And so when I format my document, I'm using a different formatter than Prettier. I use Prettier with my JavaScript, and I use Beautify with my HTML and CSS. That's my preference. Okay, so that's inline style. Okay, so that's one way to write CSS. The second way to write CSS is with embedded styles. That's done. Notice where I'm writing embedded styles. This would be considered an extra, right? Because it's up in the head element of our HTML document. And so this is done with a style tag. And then inside of this style tag is where we write our selector property values. So let's select our paragraphs. And change the text color to blue. Now you'll notice that the bottom two paragraphs change their text color to blue, but the inline style took priority over the embedded style, which is normal. You're going to learn that you can have rules that conflict. In other words, we have an embedded style that says the paragraphs go blue. We have inline style that turns this one yellow. So we have a conflict here. This would turn all of our paragraphs on the page blue. We got 3 paragraphs. But there's a conflict here because this paragraph says go yellow. So the rule of thumb is that when your selector is the same. And in this case, your selector is the paragraph tag. When your selector is the same, the closer to the content wins. We would all probably agree by looking at this that the inline style is closer to the content here. Hi mom is the content. Inline style is closer to the content. So inline style wins when the selector is the same. Okay, so here all of our paragraphs go blue, but here this paragraph goes yellow because it's more specific. Now if I were to remove this, whoops, what did I do? I undid, edit, redo. Redo. I meant to hit Control X. So let me remove the inline style, and just as you might expect, now they're all blue. Okay? But I wanted to keep that in there just to show you that when the selector is the same, closer to the content wins. Again, the benefit here, okay, what's the benefit of embedded styles? Well, now we can write one style that changes a bunch of elements on the page. That's great. Okay, we don't have to change element by element. Can you imagine if you had 100 elements going to each element and writing an inline style? That would not be efficient. That would not be enjoyable. That would be tedious. Okay, so this allows us to change a bunch of tags at once. Okay, no matter how many paragraphs, this changes all the paragraphs. Okay, so you get an instant efficiency boost when you use embedded styles over inline styles. Okay, embedded styles are great for that reason. Now, when do I use embedded styles? Personally, I use this is just my preference. I like to code embedded styles when I'm coding for the first time on a page. Okay, and what I like about it is that my styles are very close. They're in the same document. They're in the same document as my HTML. So I don't have to even switch pages. I don't have to even switch where I'm looking at very much. It's just real close together in a lot of cases. Now, you can, to counter that, you can split your view. And in Visual Studio, I might have to click around over here. You can open up multiple windows, and you could have like a split view where you got, multiple things open. And so, this is just my preference. I know that there's probably, I've had many students, prefer like a tab screen where you've got multiple things opened at once. But this is just, again, this is my preference. You choose what's efficient for you. Okay. If I had, let's just say I got an H1, and I wanted to, so this CSS, you can write this in a bunch of different ways. And a lot of times you see something like this. So this still works. Again, that white space there just kind of makes that a little bit easier to read. So we know our selector is the paragraph. We know we're changing the color to blue. H1. This changes the font to Arial, assuming you have Arial on your computer. If you don't have Arial on your computer, it'll change the font to Helvetica, if Helvetica is on your computer. If you have neither Arial or Helvetica, it changes your font to Sans Serif, which is just a generic family of fonts. And whatever the generic sans serif font is on your computer, it'll display the H1 in that. So you'll see here both of my H1s will have a different font than my paragraphs. Okay, and you can kind of see the difference in the H's if you kind of if you kind of inspect, look, that H certainly looks different, so we got a different font going on our H1s. Okay, so I just wanted to show you how to write multiple rules, right? Paragraph rule, H1 rule. If we had an H2, it kind of works the same way. Hola, mi estudiantes, E-S-T-U-D-I-A-N-T-E-S, question mark? I don't know how to spell that. Open with live server is Alt-L plus Alt-O. So if you hold Alt and then hit L, then you hit O, it opens it up. It's a hotkey that I love. It's kind of a different font there than before, even though this is very similar to the default. You could always inspect. Here you could see that the H1's font family. Here's the H2 font family. Here's the rule over here. You can in Chrome you can check this box and it'll look different. You can see the difference in the fonts. This is the default font, and then this font Cambria obviously makes it look a little different. So that's how you test to see if it's working. If this looked too similar to the default. Okay, I'm gonna pull that back up. No questions so far. This is again embedded styles. That's when I use embedded styles. We know that inline is more specific, so it overwrites embedded styles. The third way to write CSS, and the best way to write CSS, the pretty much the de facto, this is what you'd normally do, is external CSS. And to write external CSS, it's external to your HTML file. And so we make a new document with an extension of .css. And notice we have a blank document here. Now, this is all CSS. No HTML tags allowed. Okay? Big mistake that beginners make is they try and write some HTML, like a style tag. That's not... We don't need a style tag. No tags at all. Okay? No tags. And let's go ahead and write the same rule. We got a yellow font. We got a blue font. Let's change it to the external. We'll say goldenrod. Sure, whatever. Okay. So now we have an external rule written. But as you probably remember, hopefully you remember, we now need to link. This is external CSS. We now need to link to our external CSS document. Okay. Now the way to do that is with the link tag href attribute. And then you need the rel attribute of style sheet. Question was asked, what does this actually do? And my best answer is that's about as redundant as you can be. We're simply saying that this link's relevance is essentially we're linking to a style sheet. And if you know what a .css page is, then you pretty much know that you're linking to a style sheet. So I find this absolutely redundant. However, try leaving it out and you'll find that Alt-L, Alt-O, you'll find that it breaks. Okay. So I change here We're not getting any goldenrod paragraphs. Here's a paragraph, here's a paragraph, here's a paragraph, right? There's a reason for that. The reason for that is that remember, closer to the content wins. So what we have here is we have a rule that says make it gold, but then here on this page, all of our paragraphs go blue. Closer to the content wins. Embedded is closer to the content than external. So when the selectors are the same, and in this case they are, we get a conflict, and in this case, the embedded is winning out. The embedded is changing these guys to blue. Well, we have options here. The easiest option is to give one of these an ID. Not the best option, but it's the easiest. I'll just call it P2. So instead of selecting all the paragraphs, we'll just select the ID of P2. That changed our second paragraph to goldenrod. So how did I solve this? Well, I changed the selector. I said, remember when the selectors are the same, closer to the content wins. But what I did was I wrote a more specific selector, which was I gave this paragraph an ID, and then I targeted that ID. So an ID selector is considered more specific than the generic type selector, which the P, you're selecting the paragraph type, the paragraph element. All right. Now, let's go ahead and make a link here. Check this out. If I hit A and I hit Tab, it gives me a little boilerplate for my link. If I link to pound, that's going to be a dummy link, a link that doesn't go anywhere. Even though I'll say it's going to link to Google. Here's my link to Google, but I can click it and it's a dummy link. It doesn't go anywhere. All right. Styling links, we haven't covered this yet. It's best to do a colon link. That means that you have not clicked on the link yet. But notice this link has been visited, that's why it's purple. Okay, so links have basically what are called states. The states are the link state, meaning it's never been clicked. And the visited state, meaning it has been clicked. Now notice when I click when I code the visited state, now when I go back, now my link is red because this is a visited link, as in I clicked on it. Purple. That's the default. That's a bad choice. Okay? So you can see that the visited link is changing that. How do you know when to use a period or a hashtag with CSS? Good question. The hashtag, I guess before Twitter, this was known as the pound symbol. I have a hard time calling it a hashtag, so I'm going to call it the pound symbol. The pound symbol is used for IDs. The period is used for classes. Okay? And so maybe I want both of these classes, maybe I want both of these guys to be goldenrod. Instead of calling it an ID of P2, I'll call it a class of I'll just call it, I don't know, you should give it a descriptive name. So extras is not a good name. Whatever, call it the unique paragraphs. So you could put a class on multiple elements. And then here, instead of just targeting the ID, you target the class of unique paragraphs. So now both of those paragraphs will go to gold. Good question. Again, remember IDs are unique, so only one element has an ID. A class can be put on multiple things. Like check this out. I got a class on these paragraphs. Let me put a class on this H1. So notice now the H1 goes to gold. Okay, so classes are meant to be reused. IDs are meant to be single use. Okay, again, remember, if the selector is the same, closer to the content wins. But if you don't want the closer to the content to win, what you have to do is you have to write a more specific selector. And right now we know that IDs are more specific than types, right? So it basically goes from type, then your classes, then your IDs, from less specific to more specific. Got another question coming in here. So we have spent half an hour on one slide. Are you guys ready for this PowerPoint? Because it is 60 slides long. Just kidding, because I just covered a bunch of topics. So that's going to allow us to kind of skim through these slides a little bit faster, because I just covered a lot of material. Like we already covered the three different, the sequencing. Now, if you think of what CSS is, if you think about what CSS is, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So what cascading is, when the word cascade, I think of the old days of math class, and there used to be a projector that would project an image, and what a teacher would do is he'd put one sheet of paper, of clear paper, I think it was called Actate, and he would write something on that piece of paper. Then he would put another clear piece of paper, and he would write something on that one, and he'd put another three layers, and he would write on each one, and then the projector would project kind of the finished image. And that's the way that CSS works. Except for instead of individual sheets of Actate paper, you know, we've got the first sheet of paper, which is external CSS. So we get some styles from here. Then we got our second sheet of paper, which is embedded styles. So we get some styles from here. And we get our third sheet of paper, which is inline CSS. Which is, again, so what happens is all three of these sheets of paper come together to make the style for our finished web page. So that's what the word cascading means. It means you get some styles from different places, and they cascade together for a finished page. So first, the styles are loaded from external, then the styles are loaded from embedded, then styles are loaded from inline. And again, if you have conflicting rules, the closer to the content wins if the selector is the same. Okay? Now, one question that just came in is, what is the significance of the A on the style sheet? Good question. So the A on the style sheet is selecting the anchor tag. Remember, the anchor tag are our links. And links have states like the link state and the visited state. Link is a link that has not been clicked. So like a user's on a page for the first time, they would see all the links in red. But any link that they had already clicked before would turn green. So you got like the Christmas colors going on there. Now, one thing that was left off so far, the best practice is external. So if I'm writing CSS, if I'm just choosing one, 100%, the best practice is external. Here's something I didn't cover. I'm sorry, I got to take a step back. The main benefit of external, because really external is seeming pretty similar to embedded right now, the way that I've written these. But external, you can link multiple HTML pages to an external document. So those style rules that were applied to the home page can also be applied to the About Me. So if I write a paragraph, and if I write a link, and I launch that page, you can see that my link is red. That came from my style sheet. And my paragraph, I didn't have a style. So if I just said P, if I make my paragraphs nice and big, okay? So that's the main benefit. Like, why is external the best practice? Well, if I have 100 HTML pages, they can all be styled the same or styled with the same rules if I have an external document. So by far, external is the most efficient way to write CSS for that reason, because you can link 100 different pages to one style sheet, and those 100 pages are going to be styled the same way. They're going to look like they're the same website. You know, what you don't want to do is have a website, and as you click from page to page to page, your website looks completely different. You know, the end user might even think they're going from one website to another website to another website if all your pages look different. Okay, so having a consistent look and feel is really important for websites, and therefore it's important to style them with the same rules, style them with the same fonts, the same colors, etc., etc. The easiest way to do that is with an external style sheet. Glad you asked that question. Okay, any other questions about these ways to write CSS? Inline, embedded, external. I imagine if you have a question, you'll ask it. So don't wait for me to ask for questions. That's silly. Just ask. Now, there's another place you can get styles from. Which is the browser itself. Google Chrome has a default style sheet that it applies to all of your HTML. It's built into Chrome. You don't have to write in, you don't write anything. But it is why, for example, if I delete my own style sheet here, right? If I just have a paragraph and a link, and I look at this page, this link is blue. What turned it blue? Something had to turn it blue. Well, Chrome has a default style sheet that turned that link to blue. It has a font. It has a font size. In fact, I'm zoomed in, so that link looks really big. Let me zoom out. That's a default font size. That's a default font. Believe it or not, there's a lot of styles that are applied by default, which is good. It gives us kind of a default thing to work off of. But here's the problem. The problem is that Google Chrome's default style sheet might not be the same as Internet Explorer's, which might not be the same as Edge's, which might not be the same as Safari's, or Firefox. Okay, so unfortunately, all these different browsers tend to have small differences in their default style sheets. And those small differences can cause big problems in the way your pages look in different browsers. And so you might be coding and testing your page in Chrome, but if you don't test your page in Firefox, a small difference can make your page look a lot different. It can look a lot different in Firefox than it looks in Chrome. So what do we do to fix that? What you need to do is you need to get rid of the small differences. Okay, the small differences need to go away. And so the solution, how do you do that? You get rid of the small differences with this file called Normalize Css. And you can Google this, but I give you the link. And if you go to that link, you get an option to download Normalize CSS. Now, this, when you click that button, it goes here, and immediately people throw their hands up and they're confused. Well, what you can see here is that it gives some default styles for the HTML tag, for the body tag, for the main tag, for the H1 tag. Okay, and this normalize helps to get everything styled the same across different browsers. And what you do at this point is you right click and you save as. And I'm going to save this into my repo. I'm working in the homework chapter 4. And I'm just going to save it as normalize.css. So you have to save it like that. You have to right click and save as, and then put it in the right folder. Okay. So at this point, we're going to link to Normalize CSS. Last week we talked about boilerplate code for your HTML documents. I talked about the cheeseburger, the head tag, the body tag, etc., etc. I want you to add Normalize CSS to your boilerplate, to your skeleton. Anytime you're coding external CSS, I want you to link to Normalize CSS first on every web page. Every web page that you code, you should link to Normalize CSS. And then after that, you link to your custom CSS. Is there a reason that we do one before the other? Yes. The reason we link to Normalize first is that the browser will load all the normalized.css styles first, and then it will load styles.css second. So remember I said closer to the content wins. Which one's closer to the content? In this case, styles.css is closer to the content. So if you write a custom style that conflicts with normalize, your custom style would win if the selectors are the same. Okay, so that's why you link to normalize first, and then you link to styles second. And then again, so I'm just going to repeat this because I'm getting asked to do so. So you go to this link here that was provided on the PowerPoint, or you can just Google it. You click on the download button. You right click on this page and just click Save As. And then you browse to the directory where you're working. In other words, where's the HTML being written? Well, my HTML is being written inside of this directory here. and then just click Save. And you'll see a normalized.css style sheet will save, and that's how you download it. Okay, so this kind of explains even the process that I just showed, slide 8, kind of a step-by-step. Okay, been going for a little while now. I think it's a good point for a break, so I'm going to pause the recording, let everyone take a break, and we'll be right back with the recording. Okay, folks, we're back from a break, and where we left off was slide 9. And slide 9 refers to common units of measure. And so what we're talking about here specifically is when it comes to fonts or giving something a width or a height, you know, how wide is something? How tall is something on the page, which you can configure with CSS. These are values that are applied to various properties. Okay, so when we talk about a pixel, pixels are probably the easiest to understand because a pixel is a single dot on your screen. Maybe you've had a TV or maybe even a computer monitor that has had a pixel die, and in that pixel it just goes black, and so it's a space on your screen that just essentially it goes away. It goes black. A point then is a measurement of an inch. It's a fraction of an inch, a very, very, very small fraction of an inch. So many points can fit inside of pixels, right? And depending on your resolution, you have basically more points on a screen. They basically can fit so many points on a screen. So anyways, pixels, points, the point that I need to make here is a pixel is a single dot. The point is a measurement, a fraction of an inch. So it's a measurement of an inch. Then you have what's called an M and a rem, and we're going to kind of cover the difference because you could see here M is equivalent to the capital M for whatever font of that current, like maybe it's a font of a paragraph, maybe it's a font of an H1. Obviously a capital M in a paragraph is different size than a capital M in an H1. So an M is, again, a capital N of the current font, whereas a rem is a capital M of the font on the HTML element. So rem stands for root M. Again, this is pronounced like the letter M, even though it's spelled EM. And then there's someone making a joke, I guess, about the band REM. Isn't there a band? I should know that. I think that's anyways. Then you have percentage, which is to say, you know, a font is 80% of its current value. So you can scale down a font or scale up a font 120% based on what it currently is. Then you have viewport height and viewport width, which is how high is what's the height of your monitor or of your screen, or what is 1% of the width of your screen. There's a whole lot of units here, and we will use these, but we'll use them kind of as the class goes on. Okay, the textbook will tell you that the pixels and the points are absolute measurements. When you break it down, pixels and points are still really considered relative to the screen density. That is how many pixels are on your monitor, and considering your video card's resolution, and so that those things kind of come together to make up screen density. I can kind of give you maybe a link that can describe that in a little bit more detail than I'm going to go into. Ems and rems, percent, viewport height, they're all considered relative. So these, again, the big points here are that these are values that we will use in various ways throughout the class in our CSS. Okay, the next topic is borders. So let's cover some borders, and obviously minimize this here. What you don't realize necessarily when you look at a page is that there are invisible borders around everything. You don't see the borders because, like I said, they're invisible. But if I were to go into my CSS, target my paragraph, I could, let me format this, and I'll choose Beautify to format my CSS. I could turn borders on my paragraphs, and that will allow us to see that there is in fact a border going around our paragraph. Borders are around everything. I could put that same border on a paragraph, and this is how you select multiple elements. This selects the paragraphs and the bodies. You separate them with commas. You now see that around the body tag, which kind of closes right after the link. I wanted to also put that on my link. You notice that the border for the paragraph goes the entire width of the page. Let me get rid of the body so it's a little bit clearer. Notice the paragraph border goes 100% width and the link does not. Does anyone have a guess? Should ask a question. Does anyone have a guess as to why that might be? Why does the paragraph border go 100% width?
Is it because the link is an inline element?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep, got a couple answers there, and you guys were both right. Inline elements, their width is only as wide as the content. Block level elements take up the entire line's width. And so 100% of the container that it's in, since the container that this is in is the body, and the body goes 100%, then it goes 100% width of the browser. Okay, good deal. You'll notice I've got some properties here. I've got a solid line. There's different kinds of lines. You dashed. There's different values for each one of these. Dotted. Pixels, points. Remember we said we could do pixels versus points. Some of this I'm getting into uncharted territory. I haven't tried some of these things before, but 30%, okay. There's also a shorthand. So check this out. If I comment that out, there's a shorthand border. Dotted, five pixels, red. And I don't know why it's escaping me. Oh my gosh. It's not working. Oh, it's just spaces. I forgot, but I remembered. Sometimes brains do that. Sometimes brains, you have brain farts. So let's do, again, with the width, you could give a text value like thin or thick. You could give a pixel value like 10 pixel, right? So that's your border width. Your border style is typically going to be a word dotted dash. You got inset. All this stuff with borders. You got 3 border properties. You got the shorthand. You know, what if I just want to say, so those are your properties. These are your shorthand property for border. And then how is this useful? Right? Because that's, well, I've seen it, for example, if I want to put an underline on all my H1s. Like if let's say I've got some headings. And you just want to kind of underline your headings to emphasize them a little bit. Like, so I'm going to target my H1s. You can also apply the border just to the bottom. So border bottom. And I prefer there's a shorthand for this, right? Which will be 10 pixels solid blue. I'm also going to change my H1's width so it doesn't go 100% of the page to 50% of the page. 10% of the page. You get the idea. So you can apply decorative lines, underlining, you know, boxes in any sort of way, right? You could put a border on the bottom. You could put a border on the left. So these are kind of the shorthand for working with borders. Okay, and again, its most usefulness is applying an underline or some sort of like attention-getting line underneath elements. So those are your borders, and they cover that information in the PowerPoint, and they kind of put some boxes around things and kind of section things off. I mean, again, the whole point here is visually separating the different parts of the page, right? So helping someone, you know, visually separate a heading from a paragraph, that kind of thing. So there are some recommended practices when it comes to font sizes. When it comes to working with your HTML's font size, again, these are just recommendations. Generally speaking, I get these from Google. Okay, so when you're working with borders and the font size of your HTML tag, which means everything inside of HTML, so HTML is considered to be the root. Or your, again, borders are outlining, you want to go ahead and use pixels. You want to use rems. So if you're changing a font size, go ahead and use rems. If you're using margin and padding, width and height, you want to use rems. And then if you're doing page layout, which we'll do in chapter 6 or 7, we'll get into working with page layout. which is where things are at on the page, you want to use viewport height and viewport width. Okay, so that's kind of a good slide to kind of reference and kind of maybe even screenshot that, because while you might not do this today, these are best practices for things that we will do kind of moving forward. Now when it comes to color, you can give a text value like red. You can use an RGB, red, green, blue. So if you're an art major and you mix a whole lot of red with about 40% of green and about 20% of blue, you get some sort of color. I'm not very, was never an art major. I don't think I've taken an art class since, about 8th grade or something. So you might know better than I. You can also use, instead of percentages on RGB, you can use hexadecimal numbers. In other words, not hex numbers. You get the values of 0 to 255. 0 means very little red or very little of a number. 255 means a stronger color. So 255 is the heaviest red. 102, again, is kind of in the middle there, and 51 is pretty low. Or here's the hexadecimal. We have not studied hex, but hex is a numbering system, just like our numbering system uses the numbers, right? So we work with the decimal numbering system, which decimal has the values of 0 through 9. So like, the number 100 is a 1 and 2 zeros. So those are the valid values in the decimal number system. There's a binary numbering system, which are 0 and 1. And then there's a hexadecimal, which has the values 0 through 9. And then the value of 10 is an A, 11 is a B, 12 is a C, all the way up through 15, which is an F, right? So if you look at something like FF, they always start with the pound symbol, FF, F, FFF. Well, FF, let's change it to AA, FF, CC. AA represents 1010, FF represents 1515, CC represents, I think, 1212. Okay, but you can also have something like, you can have 9s in there, you can have 1s in there, you could have a D in there. So these are all valid values in a hexadecimal numbering system. 0 through 9 and A through F. The higher you go, the stronger amount of red, green, or blue is in it. So an F is a strong amount of red. A 0 would be no red. And so when you look at all Fs, what happens when you mix all the colors together, they start to go gray and eventually they go white, right? So all Fs represents your white. All zeros represents your black. The first 2 characters represent red. The second 2 characters represent green. The next 2 characters represent blue. So if we have a very strong red, we have no green, we have no blue, that's where you get your red. Okay, these are different ways to code your values of the color. Recommended practice is hexadecimal. Because when you have red, red's a very specific shade of red, but when you have hexadecimal, you wind up with 16 million different color possibilities. Okay, so you get your widest range of color when you use hexadecimal, because there's just so many different possibilities when you're coding in hex. Okay, so recommended practice, hexadecimal values. Okay, so you can see here colors like the background color and the text color are best coded in hex. Andrew, did I skip a question that you typed? You said the link is inline. I think I might have skipped a question. I might have missed that. Oh yeah. Nope. Okay, no question. That's right. That was the answer to my question, that the link was inline. I just moved on in my brain. I was thinking about colors. Right? So obviously we'll have colors display in the browser as how we code them. So when working with colors, couple of recommendations. You want to contrast well. So dark text on a light background, or vice versa, right? Black text on a white background, generally considered easiest. What's pretty interesting when you think about some of the biggest websites, generally they're pretty simple. I mean, Google, you got a white background. Most of the text is either blue or black. The logo is one thing, but they keep it simple. Here's where they say you can flip and put a light text on a dark background, is good for eye strain. So that's like the dark mode on your phone or the dark mode in Visual Studio. When it comes to contrasting well, a good place for reference, believe it or not, would be professional sports. And you look at the logos and you look at the colors of professional sports teams. Generally, they do their research and they know what contrasts well. And so you get some pretty strong colors that do a decent job of contrasting. Excuse me. But it's kind of one of those things. Keep it simple. You want to keep it easy to read. The main thing, the easier it is to read, the longer people are going to spend time on your site, the more likely they are to engage in your site, buy your product, listen to your music, whatever your site is trying to accomplish. There's also Rgba, red, green, blue, alpha, and the alpha is the opacity value, so you can make something transparent. There's HSL, hue, saturation, and lightness, and then there's hue, saturation, lightness, and alpha, which also allows for opacity. Don't see a whole lot of this. You see a fair amount of Rgba. And you can apply them individually for the hue, the saturation, and the lightness, with which the values, I should say. So here's some examples of Rgba, hue, saturation, and lightness. You can see some of them are 0 to 255 values and percentages. So the hue is 0 to 255, the saturation is 0 to 100%, the lightness is also on a percentage. And then when you have the alpha, you get values of 0 to 1. So you get like fraction or percentages, 0.5, 0.6, 0.7. And you can kind of see how that comes out. A lot of times I use a tool to help me out with this because I don't know what these colors, again, if you're an art major or if you understand how these bring color together, I don't have a deep understanding of that, but I do know how to, code it and get it to work and use the tools to get the colors that I'm looking for. Okay. Again, they kind of demonstrate something that I showed a little bit earlier in the demonstration, which is how to select something by class or how to select something by ID. There is a wildcard selector for star, which is the star selects all your elements. Generally speaking, you don't want to do too much with this star. It's not considered a good practice to do a lot of styling with star, but I will use it from time to time for convenience. But I do know that you don't want to do too much. It becomes a performance consideration because making vast changes to all of your elements with CSS could slow down the performance of a page. So that's a small consideration. Okay. I'm going to come back to slide 25. Right now, we've made selections based on elements, classes, and IDs. You can also make selections based on relationships. And so if you think of your HTML like a tree, that every nested element is a child element. So inside of a main tag, you might have an H1, you might have a UL. Inside of that UL, you might have an LI. Inside of that LI, you might have an A. And so you can see that inside of main, there's a child of UL. Inside of UL, there's a child of LI. Each LI is a sibling of one another. And then the UL is a sibling of H1. So there's parents. Main is a parent of H1. There's children. All of these are children of main. Any one of these would be a descendant of main. So there's general descendants, which include everything that's nested within it. Ascendant is anything above it, and then there's sibling. And so you can actually make selections based on relationships. Why is that beneficial? Why would you want to do that? Why wouldn't you just give everything an ID or a class? Andrew asked a question. Are there certain elements that can't be nested in other elements? Yeah, for example, a UL can only have LIs as its children. So there are some rules like that where there's not a lot of them, but there are some rules like that, and you know, the validator will always help you with that. But generally speaking, yeah, there's some of them. There's not a ton of them. To answer that question. So getting back to the question of why do we need to make this more difficult? Can't it be as simple as selecting things by IDs, classes, and elements? It can be. Yes, it can be. However, when you start throwing IDs all over your HTML, if you've ever had a cell phone and it comes preloaded with software, they call that software bloat. And a lot of end users, especially power users of technology, they get really frustrated by software bloat. They don't like having things on their phones that they don't want, nor did they install. So software bloat by the power user community is considered annoying, right? I think Samsung can be a little notorious for that. I think at times Apple can be notorious for that. So it's on both sides. Google and Apple are both have manufacturers, you know, that do a little bit of that software bloat. You know, Google's native phone, the Pixel, you know, Google's phone is considered to be free of the most clean experience. In other words, that's free of software bloat. Well, there's also something called code bloat. Code bloat is extra markup that's unnecessary. In other words, if I went around throwing IDs on everything, and classes on everything, now that might make it easier to code some CSS. You know, that might make it a little bit easier, but also effectively, if you look at the file size of our HTML, it's going to be a larger file. And it might not be that much larger, but if you have a big website and you're bloating all of your HTML full of classes and IDs, your file size might increase enough to make it noticeable on performance. Okay, because the bigger file sizes have to be downloaded across the internet, and bigger files take longer to download. Now speeds are pretty fast nowadays, and so you don't really notice this much unless you're out and like at a country home with a slow internet connection, or maybe you're driving and you're kind of on an edge connection on your cell phone. You can definitely notice that larger files take longer to download and can be noticeably slower. Okay, so to avoid this kind of code bloat, so what I'm not saying that IDs are bad. I'm not saying that classes are bad. I'm going to use them all the time. You'll use them all the time. But there might be a way to code your CSS with these different selectors relationally, where you don't have to add classes and IDs to everything. And so some selectors would be like all of the line items that are a descendant of main. If they're anywhere a descendant of main, select that line item. So again, here what we're selecting on this selector are any LI, which would be all three of these LIs that are underneath main. Any anchor tag underneath an unordered list. So that would be all three of these anchor tags. Any adjacent sibling selector. So this would be the paragraphs that are directly next to an H2. In this case, only this paragraph is an adjacent sibling. These other paragraphs are not directly adjacent, right? So how do you know what's adjacent? You go top down. So the H2, then you have a paragraph right underneath it that would be considered adjacent in a hierarchy. Then you have general sibling, means any paragraph next to the H2. So if it's a sibling at all, that would select all three of these paragraphs, right? So we've got descendants, we've got child selectors, sibling selectors, adjacent, and general siblings. So these are all different ways. Now here's the deal. The more you write CSS, the better you'll be at writing better selectors. The better we become at writing selectors, the cleaner our code is, the less bloat that our code has. I don't mind a little bit of bloat, especially as we're learning in the beginning days, but it would be better without bloat. Cell phones are better without bloat. HTML and CSS is better without bloat. There's also combination selectors. So this selects any unordered list that has a class of speakers. So there might be 10 unordered lists, but this is only selecting the ordered lists with this specific class. As I demonstrated earlier, this changes all the fonts for our headings to blue. And I got to start, doing a little bit less code demonstration, so hopefully the slideshow, because we still got 30 slides left. This guy here selects all the paragraphs, and it selects the list items that are children. This is the child selector. List items that are children of unordered lists with the class of speakers. So essentially we're selecting certain LIs and paragraphs here. So they can be combined. You can select all the elements with an attribute selector. So with the brackets here, we can select all the elements that have an href attribute, all the anchor tags with an href attribute. So these are known as attribute selectors. All of the input tags that have a type attribute of submit. Now this is complicated because we've never coded an input tag, right? But safe to say that there are going to be some input tags that have a type attribute with a value of submit. Okay, so we'll get there at some point. We're not there right now, but we will. All right, let's take another 10-minute break. I'm going to pause the recording. It's been about another hour. Take another 10-minute break here. Pause right now. Okay, folks. Back from a little break here. Earlier, I coded an anchor tag with a linked state and a visited state. And what those are actually called are called pseudo classes. Anytime you see this colon, they call that a pseudo class. And so links are typically what you use for these pseudo classes. Typically, they're used with anchor tags. You don't really see them used with too many other tags. However, they can be used with other tags. It's not just links, but typically it's on links. Active, so like if you have an anchor tag and you're looking at the active, that means the mouse is down, but it's not released. So it's like the first half of a click, if you will. Hover is if you're hovering over it with a mouse, and then focus is the keyboard has focus, which is primarily works on mobile, right? So if you're talking about a hover, on a mobile device, you don't have a mouse, so you're not hovering with a mobile device, but what you do have a focus, which means that, like for maybe example, the text box has the cursor in it. That means that text box has focus. And you can style a text box that has the cursor in it, maybe with a yellow background, so the user sees a little bit more clearly where they're typing. There's also, with these pseudo classes, there's also ways to select first children, last childs, and only childs. These are more kind of back to those relational selectors that we covered on the previous slide. You can even do fancy things like, I think of like a fantasy book, like Harry Potter, for example. In Harry Potter, the first letter of a paragraph might be this, big fantasy, this big letter that looks different than the rest of the text, and it's a big attention getter in books. And you can do the same thing on websites by targeting the first letter, for example, of a paragraph. So you'd put P : first letter, and then you can style that first letter to be kind of an attention getter. And so here's an example of selecting links. I kind of demonstrated that earlier. Hover and focus is a good idea to select those together, because it's kind of like whether you're using the mouse or whether you're using focus on a hover is for, as we said earlier, hover is for a computer, focus is more for mobile. Again, selecting the first child of a paragraph. So this is, again, a relational selector, but this is you're selecting based on relationship with a CSS pseudo class. And again, they can get complex here, right? So you're selecting the first letter of the first child of the paragraph. So there might be like, for example, a span that would be a child of the paragraph. And this would select the first letter of that span. But again, that paragraph has to be a descendant of main. So they can definitely get complex. Kind of mentioned there, you want to apply the same formatting to hover and focus for accessibility. We did mention the cascade earlier, and the way that the cascade works is that the most important rules are inline. Behind inline then would be the important tag, which we're going to talk about. I called it a tag. It's more of a important rule. It's part of CSS. It's not part of HTML. So it's the important rule in a style sheet. Then you have your normal rules in a style sheet. Then you have whatever is the default. So kind of the way they load and is first kind of the opposite order. They load 4, 3, 2, 1. It loads the default rules first, then it loads your normal rules, then the important rules, then the inline. So the important rule looks like this. I try to avoid the important rule. The reason I try to avoid it, a lot of people don't, but so you will see it out there. If you're looking at code that other people wrote, you will see this important. But it kind of breaks up the normal flow of the cascade. In other words, a lot of times you don't think to look for the important tag because it's just not common. So I try to avoid it. It is something that's out there, and it's applied in the cascade in that order. Now there's actually a list. Earlier I said, look, if the selector is the same, I said that the closer to the content wins. But then I said, well, if something has an ID, it's more specific than something without an ID. And so they call that the rules of specificity. Okay, so what are the rules of specificity? In other words, how do you make something more specific? Okay, so here's the rules. Number 1, an ID is most specific. Then you have your relational selectors and your composite selectors, which are more specific than just selecting the tag. Then a class, an attribute, or pseudo selectors, and then an element or a pseudo element selector is least specific. So the rules of specificity are pretty complex, and I will tell you, I'm not going to put this on the test. Okay? Don't overly stress slide 37, because again, the rules of specificity are complicated. I don't have this memorized. I'm not going to ask you to memorize it, but in general, I know how to make something more specific with an ID, and relational selectors after that, and then class selectors after that, and then element selectors after that. That's basically what I have memorized. And if you can get that down, that's a good place to start. All right. I have shown Chrome's developer tools before, and so again, even in this video, I've shown Chrome's developer tools. Right-click and inspect, and you can look at the HTML and the CSS on the page. It's a very, very, very useful tool for troubleshooting. This is a hugely useful tool for troubleshooting. I use this tool all the time. You will too, the more you get familiar with it. When it comes to fonts, you have font families, and a font family can have a bunch of fonts in it. And so you have serif fonts, sans serif fonts, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. Serif fonts, if you look at Times New Roman, serifs have kind of like curvatures on, like if you look at the T on Times New Roman here, you can see that it's kind of decorated. It's not like a straight T. It's got some decoration, or what you call serifs. Okay? Serif fonts are your attention getters because they've got some decoration on the letters. Okay? Sans serif fonts are the opposite. They don't have decoration. And sans serif fonts are considered the easiest to read fonts. So if you're making a web page readable, you want to put your paragraphs in sans serif fonts. Typically, you want to put your headings and your attention getters in serif fonts. Monospace is kind of like a typewriter. So like Courier New, as you can see there, is a monospace font. A lot of times you use monospace for showing code demonstrations on a web page. Like, this is what the HTML would look like, and you would code that in monospace. Cursive is cursive, and fantasy is pretty much whatever you want. Very elaborate fonts are considered fantasy. And so you code a font family you code a font with the font family property, and then you put the values separated by commas. Keep in mind, if a value has spaces, it needs to have quotes, like Times New Roman or Courier New. Okay, and I explained how that works. It looks for Arial first, then Helvetica, then sans serif. Okay, and if you apply a font family to the body tag, every element within the body will inherit that font. So fonts are inherited. So that's this last bullet here. All font properties are inherited by its descendants. Okay, a couple examples of applying fonts. I know it's late in the day, guys, but this is a very important slide. You'll be doing this a lot. A couple other properties. Font style allows you to be italic. So if you want to use CSS to style italics, you can do so. You can also use the EM tag, as we learned, or the I tag. However, that's a little bit more traditional or old school. Kind of the newer approach is to use CSS to style your fonts. Font weight can mark something as bold, and you can actually have different levels of boldness. So 900 is considered more bold than font weight of 100. Okay? Some browsers support this more than others. So typically you either set font weight to bold or you set it to normal, because a lot of browsers historically have not supported this number option. Font variant can do things like make everything capital letters or make everything lowercased. So if you come across a website where all the fonts are caps, it's probably with this font variant property. And then line height, you might be familiar with line height from your English papers. If you start doing things like double spacing, you can change how tall the line is to separate how much space it takes up on the page. Again, to help with readability purposes. Keep in mind, these slides are in your repository. So if I go into my repo here, in my repo, I go into the HTML book, 4th edition, slides. This is where you find the slides for your review. There is a shorthand for the font because there's so many different things to do with fonts. You got font family, you got font style, font weight, font size, line height. There is a shorthand. And the shorthand, you just basically throw it all in a line together. You throw a bunch of values on a line together. The only thing that you put commas on are the fonts. So this font is italic, bold, is 14 pixels for the font, 19 pixels for the line height, and Arial. Here you can see the small caps would be the variant. You can see you can kind of change the order of these. The order of these don't matter. You can kind of lump them together in any order. So small caps would be your variant. 150% would be the size. Times New Roman would be the family. When you see the slash in there, that's always the font size / the line height. You can see here the size and the family are required, the rest are optional. That's a good point. The screen readers would not be able to read the italics through CSS. So that's actually a good point, a counter argument, if you will, as to if you want to code for more accessibility purposes, which is always a good idea, then you should use the EM and the strong tag. Good point. Again, working with text, just like on an English paper, you would use an indent. You might have a text align if you want to align it vertically or to the right. So just like on an English paper, if you want to right align your text, seems a little strange a lot of times, but you can do that. Vertically align something, right? So vertical alignment on the page. If you want to put something in the middle of the page, you might vertical align middle and text align center to get something kind of dead center on the page. And then text decoration, this is really common to remove underlines on anchor tags. You might remember that our anchor tags by default have an underline on them. Well, to remove that, you do a text decoration of none. Text decoration of none. So we are actually winding down here. We're getting kind of close, because now we're just showing a bunch of examples of font size, text indent, text align, to get different formatting in CSS. We got about 10 slides to go. Text shadow. You got to be careful with text shadow. I've seen text shadow go wrong more often than I've seen it go right. Like if I'm just looking at this slide, that text shadow doesn't do anything for me. All that does is make it hard to read. Okay? So be careful with text shadow. It's kind of a neat feature, but more often than not, you got to really ask yourself, does that look good? And if you're asking me, does that look good? I don't know. I generally think I don't like it too much. So that's actually done with CSS. Oop, I gotta pause this recording. I gotta take a phone call. Excuse me, guys. Just give me 2 minutes. Sorry. Okay. Don't like to take phone calls during class, but I am expecting an important call. So you can see text shadow is done here. You've got how far horizontally are you offsetting the shadow? How far vertically are you offsetting the shadow? The shadow color and the blur radius, meaning how much around the letters is it blurry, right? If you think of a radius around, a radius on a circle is basically how much around the letters is blurred. In this case, text shadow can just be configured with 4 pixels would be the horizontal offset, and 4 pixels would be the vertical offset. So 4 pixel, 4 pixel kind of gives you something like that. -2 pixel, -2 pixels brings it up. And, instead of going down, it would be -2 pixels would bring it up. -2 pixels would bring it to the left. That's why you see the shadow up and to the left. 4 pixels would be a radius, and red would be the color. Again, not a big fan of these. It makes text harder to read. Generally, keep your shadows dark, preferably black, and don't have a bunch of shadows in a bunch of different directions. That just complicates it. Okay. A big thing that CSS does is moves things around on the page, and this chapter does introduce this concept of floating. And so what floating does is normally things go from top to bottom, right? That's called normal flow. All of our HTML goes from top to bottom, and that's how it shows on the page. But floating something takes it out of that kind of top to bottom flow, and it just says go as far as you can to the left in the container that you're in. So all of our elements are nested, and so go as far to the left in the container that you're in. And so here, if we look, we got an image, a couple of headings, and we tell that image to float to the left. That's going to produce this image off to the left. Okay, we're going to work a whole lot with positioning, but this is just kind of showing you a simple float. And then just a whole lot of code kind of here at the end. That was a long lecture. That was a very long lecture. Tonight, we have homework that's due. I've opened up your homework on Inside Rankin, and a lot of the homework is just practice. The homework might say demonstrate demonstrate an adjacent sibling selector. So you get to code the HTML, you get to code the CSS. I would make it an external CSS. And I just want you to practice writing and getting it to work. Okay? So this is not necessarily going to make some beautiful page. I don't care if the page is dog ugly. Okay? As long as you're practicing with these different kinds of selectors. All right, that is chapter 4 homework. It's open. I'm going to stop the recording here.